$47,000 in cash, 2.3 pounds of fentanyl, and an arsenal of illegal firearms were seized. And this was not evidence taken from a border checkpoint, a cargo ship, or a known trafficking corridor. Everything was found inside an unremarkable Airbnb townhouse in Wisconsin, situated in a family-friendly suburb where children walked to school every morning and neighbors waved at each other from their driveways. Nothing about the exterior suggested that a major federal operation was about to take place. It was a location engineered to disappear into the background of daily life. And for that precise reason, it operated without raising a single alarm for over a month. How could a property designed for weekend getaways and family vacations function so effectively as a critical piece in a criminal supply chain right in the heart of communities where life continued as if nothing was wrong? If you want to understand how operations like this can embed themselves so deeply that they become virtually undetectable inside neighborhoods across America, stay with this story, because this case is not just about one townhouse or a single bust. This was not a sudden intervention triggered by an anonymous phone call. It was the calculated endgame of a strategy constructed layer by layer, silently, and with extraordinary patience. The DEA and federal task forces did not pursue suspects through conventional means, and they did not respond to gunshots or visible criminal behavior. Instead, they followed a thread that seemed entirely innocent. Short-term bookings, unusually quiet properties, vehicles pulling up for just minutes before driving away. No loud gatherings, no complaints, nothing obvious enough to make anyone suspicious. Everything merged seamlessly into the expected flow of vacation rental activity. Rather than moving quickly, agents chose to hold back. They allowed the behavior to continue, letting the complete structure reveal itself over time. The mission was no longer about confirming illegal activity existed, but about understanding the precise function of this location and how deeply its connections ran beyond a single property. And when the decision to move was finally made, it was not impulsive. It was engineered to sever the property's entire operational capacity in one decisive stroke. So what made federal agents determine that particular morning was the moment when waiting was no longer strategic? And where did this Wisconsin Airbnb actually fit within a network threading itself quietly through the fabric of American suburban life? The initial indicators did not arrive through emergency calls or dramatic incidents, but through observations so mundane they almost went unnoticed. Sheriff departments across several Wisconsin counties started receiving minor complaints about brief, repetitive vehicle activity at various short-term rental addresses. The reports were vague and easy to brush aside. Cars would arrive, idle for a few minutes, someone would enter the property, and then the vehicle would depart almost immediately. It occurred repeatedly, often at irregular hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes during early morning hours. No one lingered long enough to create disturbances. No parties materialized. No neighbors filed complaints about arguments or suspicious behavior. On the surface, nothing about it required urgent investigation. That was exactly what made it so easy to dismiss. In neighborhoods saturated with vacation rentals, constant movement is expected. Guests cycle through regularly. Vehicles appear and vanish. Quiet properties are typically viewed as well-managed properties. For days, then weeks, the activity persisted without setting off any serious concerns. But as deputies began cross-referencing the reports, something started to crystallize. The regularity was too consistent. The timing was too methodical. These were not ordinary visitors arriving at random intervals. The same vehicles kept reappearing, following nearly identical routes, staying for almost precisely the same duration each time. It was motion without deviation. What initially resembled harmless rental traffic began to feel choreographed. Officers observed that these visits never converted into extended stays. There were no suitcases being unloaded, no families settling in, no grocery deliveries or garbage accumulating outside. The properties stayed quiet, vacant, and perpetually reset, as though anticipating the next brief arrival. Each visit adhered to the same protocol, almost robotic in its execution. For investigators accustomed to recognizing behavioral patterns, that consistency demanded attention. As local law enforcement pooled their observations, the scope expanded. Comparable reports were surfacing around several rental properties, not confined to a single address. Each location appeared unremarkable in isolation, but collectively they suggested orchestration. The behavior did not align with standard guest activity, yet it also did not venture into territory that would normally warrant immediate action. It existed in a middle ground, functioning just beneath the level that would typically prompt intervention. That middle ground is precisely where sophisticated networks often remain concealed the longest. Understanding the potential magnitude, local agencies discreetly involved federal partners. DEA agents examined the accumulated surveillance data and immediately grasped the danger of premature action. Moving too quickly could neutralize a single property while leaving the underlying apparatus completely intact. Instead, they committed to a strategy of observation and patience. No traffic stops, no casual inquiries at doors, no overt law enforcement visibility. The aim was not to disrupt the activity, but to let it expose its full dimensions. Over the subsequent weeks, agents monitored movements across multiple addresses. They documented arrival times, vehicle makes and models, and visit durations. Patterns emerged with remarkable precision. Certain rentals would become busy for a limited period, then abruptly go silent. Shortly afterward, activity would manifest at a different location. The transition was fluid, almost choreographed. From an external perspective, it resembled typical rental turnover. To investigators, it resembled systematic rotation. That rotation raised deeper questions. Whoever orchestrated the activity was not utilizing Airbnb properties as residences. They were being deployed as temporary operational stations, activated and vacated before attention could consolidate. The pace of movement indicated planning. The absence of personal inhabitation indicated intent, and the silence indicated purpose. By this point, the investigation had evolved again. The properties themselves were no longer the primary focus. Eliminating one unit would achieve nothing substantial. Even eliminating several would only temporarily slow the mechanism. The genuine insight emerged from comprehending what enabled the network to persist. It was not concealment, intimidation, or bribery. It was velocity. The faster the rotation, the less detectable the operation became. The network maintained its advantage over suspicion by refusing to remain stationary. Properties were not the core vulnerability. They were interchangeable components. What truly mattered was how rapidly the system could transition, recalibrate, and proceed without interruption. That understanding marked a pivotal moment for federal agents. The threat was not anchored to geography. It was woven into the methodology itself. And that was the revelation investigators could no longer overlook. The properties were never the fundamental problem. The true advantage of the network was the speed at which those properties could be cycled before anyone had sufficient time to grow suspicious. Once federal investigators determined they had accumulated enough intelligence, the case transitioned quietly into its most critical phase. Search warrants were authorized following weeks of surveillance, cross-referenced timelines, and verified movement patterns that confirmed the behavior was far from coincidental. There was no urgency broadcasting itself, no public announcement, and no overwhelming display of authority. The objective was precision rather than spectacle. Moving prematurely could collapse only one node. Moving too late could permit the entire infrastructure to dissolve without consequence. When the operation finally commenced, it did not resemble a traditional raid. There were no doors breached violently, no commands shouted through megaphones. Agents entered the Airbnb townhouse the way a property inspector or cleaning crew might enter. Composed, deliberate, systematic. The intention was to preserve the scene exactly as it existed before anyone connected to the location could respond or adapt. By the time the entrance was secured behind them, the opportunity to flee had already expired. Inside, What agents discovered validated everything their surveillance had suggested. The townhouse was not disorganized. It was methodically arranged. On a table near the main living area, investigators found approximately 2.3 pounds of fentanyl divided into precise portions and sealed for distribution. Adjacent to the narcotics, currency had been counted and organized into neat stacks, separated into uniform bundles. The cash was not concealed in hidden compartments or crammed into bags. It was displayed openly, like merchandise awaiting shipment. Firearms were also present, positioned within immediate reach rather than secured in safes or hidden from view. They were not placed there in desperation or haste. Their positioning suggested preparedness. This was not a space where occupants had been caught off guard. It was a space configured to function efficiently if circumstances deteriorated. Every item within the townhouse appeared to serve a specific function, and nothing appeared haphazard. What struck investigators most was the absence of improvisation. This was not the aftermath of someone frantically attempting to hide evidence. There were no rushed efforts to conceal drugs or money. Everything was positioned calmly, predictably, as though the operators never anticipated interruption. The townhouse did not present itself as a crime scene discovered mid-error. It presented itself as a waypoint in a system designed to keep flowing. Timing emerged as essential. Agents subsequently confirmed that activity logs indicated the property was approaching the conclusion of its operational window. The rotation schedule suggested the unit would likely have been cleared within days. Had the operation been postponed even slightly, the townhouse could have been emptied, returned to normal rental circulation, and replaced by another address before suspicion ever materialized at this location. The network had constructed its resilience around narrow margins, and federal agents had penetrated just before one of those margins closed. As the search progressed, agents cataloged every detail: the packaging methods, the spatial arrangements, the condition of materials. Nothing indicated long-term storage. This was a brief pause, a transfer point. The drugs were not intended to remain. The cash was not intended to accumulate. Everything was staged for movement. Once again, the evidence reinforced a central understanding. The operation did not depend on controlling territory. It depended on maintaining momentum. 3 suspects were detained without incident. There was no attempt to escape, no physical resistance, no confrontation. The individuals appeared composed, almost accepting, as though they recognized the moment had finally arrived. Their arrests represented the first visible disruption to the network, but investigators were cautious not to interpret it as a conclusion. Because even as the processing of arrests proceeded, agents were already examining beyond the immediate circumstances. The evidence inside the townhouse narrated a broader account. The suspects had access but lacked authority. They handled materials but did not architect the system. The scale, coordination, and exactness of the operation pointed to an organization far more extensive than any 3 people could represent. By the close of operations that day, federal authorities had secured the premises and removed all evidence. From the outside, the townhouse returned to stillness. The street appeared unchanged. Neighbors continued their routines without awareness. Nothing about the property hinted at what had just transpired within its walls. But for investigators, the significance was unmistakable. The raid had verified the network's existence. It had illuminated its techniques, and it had demonstrated how narrowly it had avoided disappearing entirely. The arrests were genuine, the seizure was substantial. But the most crucial realization emerged in the aftermath. The 3 suspects in custody were not the designers of the system. They were only functional elements within it. What ultimately exposed the deeper architecture of the operation was not a dramatic revelation or a single breakthrough discovery, but the gradual accumulation of digital traces left behind. Mobile devices seized during the arrests, encrypted messages recovered through forensic analysis, and booking patterns extracted from multiple platforms began constructing a narrative far more expansive than any single property could contain. When federal agents arranged the information collectively, a structure emerged with disturbing precision. This was not a collection of independent rentals. It was a system functioning with near-industrial efficiency. Agents reconstructed the rental timelines first. One property would be vacated on precisely the day another was occupied. There were no overlapping bookings. There were no unexplained gaps. The transitions were seamless. As soon as one location became inactive, another became operational. The rhythm never faltered. It advanced like a production line, with each unit fulfilling its role before being quietly replaced. Nothing suggested randomness. Everything indicated orchestration. Further investigation revealed that the suspects rarely maintained the same property for extended periods. Each Airbnb existed in the system only long enough to complete its designated function. Then it was abandoned before curiosity could accumulate. Booking records displayed short reservations clustered tightly together, frequently under alternate identities, sometimes utilizing different financial instruments, but invariably following the same framework. Check in, activate, transfer product, check out, reset, repeat. The elegance of the process contributed to its effectiveness. Investigators understood that Airbnb itself was never the enterprise. It was the foundation. The network did not depend on property ownership, extended leases, or permanent facilities. Instead, it borrowed legitimacy from an established platform engineered for convenience and speed. Short-term rentals provided precisely what the operation required: immediate access, minimal personal interaction, limited verification procedures, and most critically, no sustained oversight from neighbors or property managers. Every vulnerability in the short-term rental ecosystem was leveraged. Communication occurred through applications, not face-to-face meetings. Hosts rarely encountered guests personally. Complaints were addressed digitally and typically after departures. If a property attracted questions, it was simply abandoned and substituted. The system did not resist investigation. It outpaced it. By the time suspicion developed, the operation had already relocated. Devices recovered during the investigation demonstrated coordination across locations. Messages referenced addresses only momentarily before directing attention to subsequent sites. No individual location was treated as significant. What mattered was continuity. Notes discovered in one unit cataloged dates and times rather than identities. Movement schedules held more importance than personal details. The fewer identifying elements involved, the less exposure existed if any component of the system became compromised. Agents characterized the structure as modular. Each Airbnb operated as a temporary module that could be exchanged without affecting the remainder of the network. There was no central headquarters visible in the data. No single address connected all elements. That architecture made the system durable. Eliminating one node did not collapse the operation. It merely created a brief delay before another location assumed its function. What made the system particularly successful was how unremarkable it appeared. Short-term rentals exist everywhere. Guests cycle through constantly. Turnover is anticipated. Quiet properties are expected. Nothing about the movement alone would generate concern unless observed in broader context. The network relied on that familiarity. It concealed itself within behavior that had already become normalized. As federal agents expanded their analysis, the implications intensified. Booking records suggested similar patterns extending beyond Wisconsin. The same temporal structures, the same brief reservations, the same rapid cycling. Some addresses appeared briefly in logs connected to other states. Initially, those entries seemed inconsequential. But once agents understood what patterns to recognize, they could not dismiss them. This was not a localized improvisation. It was a template, a methodology replicable wherever short-term rentals operated. The facility with which it could expand generated immediate alarm. If one state had uncovered this structure, how many others were still functioning undetected, employing the same playbook, rotating through properties before law enforcement could respond effectively? By this stage, investigators were no longer concentrating on individual suspects or isolated seizures. They were examining architecture, how the system was constructed, how it moved, and how it survived by never occupying any location long enough to be cornered. The realization reoriented the investigation entirely. What had originated as an inquiry into suspicious Airbnb activity in Wisconsin had transformed into something far more disturbing. The operation was not defined by geography. It was defined by methodology. And that led to a conclusion that altered everything. Wisconsin was not the only jurisdiction where the system was functioning. As details from the Wisconsin case circulated through law enforcement channels, investigators in other states began reassessing cases previously considered isolated incidents. In Arizona, officers had previously discovered an Airbnb property filled not with vacation amenities or personal effects, but with sealed containers stacked throughout empty rooms. In Ohio, another short-term rental had produced synthetic opioids, organized cash bundles, and weapons positioned for rapid access. Each incident had been addressed locally at the time. Now, examined together, they formed an unmistakable pattern. The parallels were remarkable. None of the properties exhibited signs of actual habitation. There was no clothing, no food, and no evidence of daily living. Instead, narcotics were packaged uniformly and positioned in plain view. Cash was counted and organized. Weapons were placed within arm's reach. These were not permanent storage facilities. They were temporary nodes designed to operate briefly and then vanish. In Arizona, the magnitude was significantly larger. Officers responding to a routine property turnover discovered hundreds of pounds of methamphetamine staged for transport. Before the premises could be fully secured, the renters returned in a cargo van expecting a routine pickup. They believed the system remained intact. Instead, they were arrested. The timing reflected what investigators had witnessed in Wisconsin. Ohio followed an identical pattern. Another Airbnb, another brief reservation, another interior devoid of personal presence. This location contained fentanyl, other controlled substances, substantial cash reserves, and multiple firearms. Investigators observed that the arrangement and packaging mirrored other cases almost precisely, suggesting coordination rather than coincidence. What alarmed federal authorities most was the confidence displayed by the suspects. In multiple cases, individuals returned on schedule, convinced that the rotation cycle had not been compromised. Speed had always protected the network, and until then, it had functioned flawlessly. As agencies exchanged intelligence, a broader conclusion crystallized. These were not small groups imitating one another. The uniformity across states pointed to a shared system constructed around short-term rentals, rapid turnover, anonymity, and electronic transactions. Analysts redirected focus from individuals to logistics, mapping how drugs flowed through rented spaces, like inventory through a distribution center. The network's resilience resided in its design. Renting Airbnbs is lawful. Brief stays are routine. Rotating locations is not criminal. Each action appeared legitimate independently. Only when connected did the structure become apparent. That was the most troubling insight. The system survived because it appeared ordinary, and it succeeded because, examined individually, nothing within it was illegal. The operation in Wisconsin was not merely another successful law enforcement action, and it was not defined by the quantity of drugs seized or the number of arrests processed. Its genuine significance resides in what it revealed about how contemporary criminal networks adapt to the systems embedded in everyday American life. The operation exposed how convenience, velocity, and legality can be combined into something far more threatening when exploited with calculation. Short-term rentals, rapid logistics, digital payments, and anonymous reservations are all lawful tools widely utilized by millions of people for entirely legitimate purposes. Yet, when aligned precisely, they formed a framework that allowed criminal activity to move quietly, efficiently, and almost invisibly. This case compels a fundamental shift in perspective. The concern is no longer confined to hidden warehouses or isolated criminal territories. It now extends into ordinary neighborhoods, routine transactions, and platforms designed for simplicity rather than scrutiny. The Wisconsin network did not conceal itself in darkness. It operated in plain view, depending on the assumption that normal activity would never face examination. That assumption held for an extended period. The most significant question, then, is not how many suspects were apprehended, but how many comparable systems continue operating undetected. If criminal activity no longer requires secrecy to survive, but instead flourishes within everyday routines, how does that transform the way security must be conceptualized? Where do you believe this model could already be operational next? Share your perspective in the comments and follow along for the next deep investigations as they develop.